So a lot of these things start out with a story. And this particular story is particularly relevant right now for some things that are happening in the stock market. Has a lot to do with GameStop. Well, at least part of the story does. But if you go back a few years, there was a company, Dole Foods. You've probably had their pineapple or their bananas. Anybody for a banana? Dole Foods had a new management team, and they were wealthy, and they wanted to take the company private. It was publicly traded at that point in time. And I'm probably going to get one of these numbers wrong, but they're approximately right. At the time, they had $38 billion in stock. Okay? And they wanted to take it private, so they needed to come up with this and repurchase the stock. When they went out and started looking, they found out that there was something like 19 billion more. Okay? So you add the two together, one way or another, this was fake. And you go, how could you have fake stock? I mean, how do you have a $19 billion whoops in the stock market? Well, it turns out that the stock market was built a long time ago, and for stocks to actually trade takes about 3 days. And instead of trading stocks, they created futures. And in futures, you can sell stocks you don't have by basically borrowing somebody else's. And today you see lots and lots of stock trades that happen in a millisecond. But these aren't real stock trades. There is some sort of a brokerage house out there. And the brokerage house says, I will sell you these for a certain price, but I don't own any, so I will just simply borrow some from somebody else. Now, they are supposed to actually clear the borrowing and actually do the borrowing, but sometimes, they sold you some, but then they bought some, and then they sold some, and then they bought some, and somewhere in this process, there's zero stock. And you think you own it, but you don't really own it unless you actually got the certificate in your hand. What you own is a promise from the trading house that if you asked for the certificates, they would be able to send them to you. But it turns out that lots of times they don't actually have them. Okay, they've bought and sold it hundreds of times in a day. And, they could probably get some if they needed to. So Dole, when they wanted to go private, they found out there were way more being traded than the number that were actually in existence. They eventually ended up doing a deal to repurchase all the stock, including ones that they had never issued. But you start looking at something like this and you say, how common is this? And it turns out that this is pretty common, that actually the stock market can be manipulated with false stocks, that there actually is a problem out there. And you say something like 1/3 of the stock market is probably fake. Now, if you were to actually set up a stock system that were actually accurate, you'd have to have some way of consolidating different people's views of the market and actually reaching some sort of consensus whenever any trade happens. And that would be pretty cool. I mean, we're talking about billions, if not trillions of dollars of value could be accurately tracked. And we have that kind of a system. And they tend to call these things initial coin offerings on a blockchain. And basically the idea is, instead of just your blockchain with your set of blocks here, we'll have some additional information over here that says that for a particular set of accounts, this person has 5, that one has 10, and then we issue tokens based on this other sidechain. And this list that we've got over here of these people. But every time we make a change in the list, it gets recorded out here on the chain. So this list that we have becomes authoritative. This kind of a list takes 2 different flavors. And this is thanks to our folks in Switzerland, Ethereum. there's a thing called an ERC20. And I don't love the names, but that is a Ethereum request for change, number 20, and there's another one, an Ethereum request for change 721. And these ERC numbers, you can look them up. They reflect defects in Ethereum on GitHub, and that is the defect number in Ethereum. But the resolution to these different kinds of things has resulted in two kinds of tokens, by and large. There are some exceptions. ERC20s are what we'd call mutable. Okay? As in, one is just like the next. As in, I have 5. I don't care what the token is, I have 5 or I have 10. So these are your mutable tokens, like it's just how many. And they're interchangeable. Now, ERC 721 came along with one of my most fun things that I've never made any money at, but yes, I own 2 CryptoKitties that are basically worthless. But, they had this new standard, ERC 721, and it had to do with CryptoKitties. You just have to buy a CryptoKitty. So I bought 2. They're completely worthless. But in any case, ERC 721 is non-mutable, as in each token has a unique identifier that identifies that token. So instead of having a count of how many you have a count of how many tokens you have and the actual token IDs themselves. So ERC 721 is for things like collectibles or data that you want to track. I have so many of these things, and there's information about each individual one of these tokens. And there are lots of applications for this kind of a thing as well, besides CryptoKitties. For instance, you might have an environmental credit that is tied to a particular piece of land. And you've got to say, yes, I have this environmental credit. I have 5 of these credits, but this one is tied to this piece of land, this one is tied to this piece of land, this one's tied to this piece of land, and consequently there's a physical item that it is associated with. In Australia, they used ERC 721s in Queensland, Australia, as the way to track individuals' driver's licenses. So you actually have an ERC 721 token for your driver's license. And, my driver's license is not your license, even though we each only have one, but we have an individual license that has individual data. So these are individual things. And there's a lot of reasons for using this kind of a token. Now, in some other chains like Cardano, we're just coming up on the ability to create these sidechain tokens. And that's coming up here in this first quarter of this year on a new release. But they don't call them the same thing. They're just sidechain tokens that are mutable or immutable. So some people are calling them different things. In any case, ICOs tend to be these mutable ones. And collections of actual physical things you're talking about over here. Now, the good thing about something on the stock market and putting it out here as an ERC20 is you create some things. It's pretty simple in Ethereum to do. But then when you actually trade them, they're all resolved on-chain. So there is consensus, and there's only one owner for a particular thing at a time. You don't have these kind of multi-billion-dollar whoopses. Now, we need to talk a little bit about what money is and what stocks and bonds are here. Money is by and large mutable. Nobody particularly cares that I have a dollar bill with a particular serial number on it, even though every dollar bill has a serial number. It's generally not of a concern to anybody. I mean, maybe if I got the money in a nefarious way, like I kidnapped somebody and they paid me, they'd be tracking the serial numbers on the dollars to see where I spend it so they could go throw me in jail. But most people don't care. One $20 bill is just like the next $20 bill. So they're more over here in this kind of a category. Now, if I have baseball cards and I want to track baseball cards, they're definitely individual. Because, this one is in perfect mint condition, has never been touched by a human, and this other one looks like it's been through the washing machine a couple times. Those are collectibles. And there are different applications for these types of things. For instance, there is a system on a blockchain in Estonia that tracks the value of the titles of property. And my piece of property is not like yours, so it's over here in the ERC 721. And what's the economic value of something like that? Well, let's calculate it out for the United States. 2 years ago, there were 5.2 million houses sold in the United States. This is not commercial real estate. This is not other things. This is just houses. Now, the reason I picked on houses is because most of you are going to graduate. At some point, you're going to get a mortgage. You're going to buy a house. So this is relevant to your future. The United States Realty Association, the American Realty Association, estimates that the cost of title insurance and title search is $3,400, roughly speaking, per sale. Okay? If we multiply these two things together, we get about $19 billion a year. Now, in Estonia, since they have all of their titles on a blockchain, they check the data when it went on chain, and it's immutable. It can't be lied about. This same thing that's costing us $3,400 costs €20. Okay? Or in today's dollars, about US $22, $23. So this is our cost. This is their cost. So there's $19 billion up for grabs. Now, if you went out and did this and you put all the titles for property in the United States on a blockchain, yes, it's a big, hard job. Okay? Wyoming has a desire to do this for the state of Wyoming. This is just residential. You probably also want to do commercial. If you're really going to get after this program, you also want to look at underground rights, oil mining rights, coal mining rights, natural resources that are under the ground. You may also want to get into some things that are above the ground, like is your building going to put shade on somebody else's building and destroy their solar panels? You probably also want to look at things like water rights out here in the western United States. And it isn't just purchase. If you're going to do this, there's also remodeling and how you handle liens on properties, so that if you need go get a new kitchen, and there are 19 different contractors that worked in this, they all have to sign off, the subcontractors, that you paid everybody so that you don't have a lien on your property. Because when you want to go and sell it, you want to clear all those liens and show that the property has a clean title. So there's some work involved in this. But look at that. $19 billion just in one thing. And that isn't all these other things like car titles. There's a whole realm of titles that right now are basically on paper. On paper is an understatement. I've looked, and in the state of Wyoming, about 2/3 of our property titles are not just on paper, but if you want to actually go and find out what's going on with it, there's books in the county assessor's office. The books are handwritten. Okay? And they go back into the 1800s here. I'm certain if you go to Virginia, they go back into the 1600s or 1500s. So some of these things are really old hand records, and you'd have to digitize all of them. And that would be a lot of effort. Mexico is doing it. So, if you go and buy a new piece of property in Mexico, Mexico's still mad about Texas, so Americans can't do it. But other than that, of us stealing a piece of their country, if you set up a corporation so that the corporation in Mexico can go buy this house for you, even though you're an American, so that you can actually buy a house, you will find out that all new property deeds in this country are done on a blockchain. This is why. So this is kind of the ERC 721 contract. The because this is unique. I mean, if your piece of property is here and the neighbor's is here, those two are not interchangeable. They are not mutable. They are really two different things. They have different boundary information. They have different values. Okay? If yours has a road in front of it and theirs doesn't have any road access, you probably have lots of money and they have a sad face. So each one of these things is important, and we've done it in multiple dimensions here because you've also got, do you own the mining rights to this property? If a bank finances the property lots and lots of times on selling the property, they claim the mining rights and you don't transfer the mining rights even if you bought the property. So banks have got all these mining rights to all this property, but they don't know where it is. And if you actually go through and produce a system like this and track the mining rights, you can probably get a lot of money out of the banks, because the cost for somebody like an oil or gas producer to go into a valley and say, we're going to develop this valley for natural gas, is millions of dollars of research into who owns the mining rights under the land. And if you can clarify that and put that into a single system in a database that is authoritative, that's worth a lot of money. That is worth a bunch. So we've got these two different kinds of contracts. Now, I promise we talk about stock. Stock is where a company sells a piece of its future profits so that it can raise capital. And consequently, the value of the stock is really a question about the future value of the company. I mean, if the company is going along like this and not growing, well, it has some level of profit out of its expenses, and you're buying that future profit. If the company looks like this, and the profit is increasing over time and they're growing, that's a completely different kind of picture. So there's a relationship between the price of stock and what the company does. Now, there's risk involved in this stock, because if you think it's going to do that, but it does that, your stock is worth zero. So there's risk involved in stocks. There's risk involved in the equivalent thing, some sort of an ICO on a blockchain. Now, the trade-off versus stocks is you might consider bonds. A bond is a loan of money to the company. And the way they do this is they say that over here at the end, the maturity of the bond, it might be worth $1,000. When you buy it, it's less. So today you purchased it, but you only paid this amount. When you sell it, it has gone up to this amount. And this piece out here is what we would call a discount. And usually it's done in 3 decimal places. So a 1% discount would be 10 points, BSP. Bias points? Basis points. Basis points. But it's 3 decimal places. So there is this discount that you get for giving them your money. How much this is should be a reflection of the risk in the company. But the problem with this is it is a fixed maturity, fixed value. And at the same time, you're paying money for this. Now, your money is not fixed either. Money can have inflation. So if inflation is higher than the amount that you're getting back, you're losing money by giving them stuff. If inflation, so you got to put this in perspective of what your choices are. Now, there is an advantage to bonds in some people's perspective because it's guaranteed. And it turns out that stocks grow faster than bonds do. And this has been going on for decades. People still invest in bonds because they want a guaranteed rate of return over time. I personally don't touch bonds. I just invest in the stock market because I want the higher rate of return. And I'm willing to say, on average, even though I have had, and yes, I have invested in companies that have gone bankrupt, even though I know there is risk, on average, I do better over here in the stocks. That leads us to a question about risk. And what do you consider risky? I mean, that there's this company, RPM, and if you look at the walls in University of Wyoming, they're painted with paint that came from RPM. You look at a desk and the glue that holds the Formica on the top of the desk up there in all the classrooms is an RPM product. They build industrial glues and coatings. And for 60-some years, they have always paid out their dividends and the price of their stock has increased. That's a track record. That's through recessions. That's through lots of different things. So what is the risk in something like that? Well, my contention is it wouldn't be very high, whereas if you get bonds that pay a decent amount in some place like Puerto Rico, they're government bonds and supposedly they can't default on them. They will pay you the money, but that also has its own risks, and maybe they can default on them. So they're not risk-free. So on average, I tend to pick the riskier one and say I will make more money at it and take my chances against loss.